We're into 1943 of the full Essex-Class timeline. In the last video we looked at construction throughout 1942 and the commission of USS Essex on the last day of the year. In this episode we'll look at the design changes and the arrival of the Essex-Class in the Pacific Theatre. As we reveal 1943, we can see that 6 more units were placed in commission, which along with the Essex represents around 30% of the total built. An astonishing 9 units were laid down across 5 shipyards on the east coast. Based on wartime experience in 1942, it was decided to alter the design to incorporate more anti-aircraft defence. This involved extending the bow above the waterline to provide the space to house an extra 40mm quad mount, improving anti-aircraft defence on the bow. The sponson on the fantail was also enlarged to add an extra 40mm quad mount. The US Navy made no distinction between the old and new Essex designs, but they are invariably referred to as long bow or long hull units. On this chart, the long bow units will be written in light blue font and the short bow in white. Norfolk Navy Yard, with 3 units on order, became the 4th yard to join the programme on January the 15th, when CV-38, the first longbow unit, was laid down on the building ways as Shangri-La, a reference to the famous Doolittle raid the previous year. In March, CV-39 was laid down as Lake Champlain in the newly completed Dry Dock No. 8. The first launch of 1943 was at Newport News, where the Yorktown was launched by the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt on January the 21st. 10 days later, CV-14 was laid down as Hancock in her place. Less than 3 months after her launch, Yorktown left Newport News to be commissioned at Norfolk Navy Yard on April 15th. The Intrepid was floated out of Shipway No. 10 on April the 26th, and just a couple of weeks later, CV-15 was laid down as Randolph in her place on May the 10th. This colour footage from the National Archives, taken in May or June, shows Intrepid fitting out. Part of the flight deck is positioned onto Hornet on Shipway No. 9. Randolph in the early stages in Shipway No. 10. And Franklin in Shipway No. 11, completed up to the second deck. The subassembly of Franklin's bow ready to be installed. On June 14th, 3 more units were ordered to use up authorised tonnage. The numbers 41 to 44 had been taken by the new Midway-class carriers, so CV-45 was ordered from Philadelphia, CV-46 from Newport News, and CV-47 from Bethlehem Steel at Quincy. As CV-46 was not completed, it's not a permanent fixture on this chart. Later in the year, Intrepid became the 5th unit to be placed in commission on August the 16th, and 2 weeks later, the Hornet was launched on the 30th. Her place on Shipway No. 8 was taken by CV-21, laid down as Boxer in September. The shipyard was in full swing now, and Franklin was floated out of Shipway No. 11 in October after just 10 months of work. Finally, Hornet was commissioned on the 29th of November, becoming the 7th unit in commission. After the frantic activity at Newport News, the only event at Brooklyn Navy Yard that year was CV-31 laid down as Bonhomme Richard on Slipway No. 2 on February the 1st. In fact, with such a backlog in orders, CV-32 was reordered from Newport News in March. At Quincy, CV-19 was laid down as Ticonderoga on the 26th of January, the second long bow unit to be started. However, on May the 1st, the name was swapped with Hancock, then building at Newport News. According to Hancock's cruise book, This was done in response to an offer from John Hancock Insurance Company to raise money through war bonds to pay for the ship's construction, and they wanted the Hancock built in their home state. Lexington was the second unit commissioned in the dry dock at South Boston Naval Annex on the 17th of February, and Bunker Hill the fourth unit on the 25th of May. This is an aerial photograph of the Bethlehem Steel Yard at Quincy around May 1943. The Wasp was launched in August and was placed in commission in November, becoming the sixth unit to join the fleet. At the fifth and final shipyard, Philadelphia joined the program on March 15th, when CV-36 was laid down as Antietam on slipway number 3, and later in the year CV-37 as Valley Forge on slipway number 2 on September 14th. This name would also change before completion. Once the new carriers had been placed in commission and received their new crew, the process of trials and tests were commenced to ensure the vessel was in full working order. Most units, wherever they were built, conducted their trials in the Chesapeake Bay area. This included trials with catapults, gunnery, arresting gear, and many others. When complete, the ship was ready to receive what was known as the Sunday Punch, or the Air Group. The mix of aircraft type in 1943 was generally 36 fighters of the new F-6F Hellcat, 36 dive bombers, the old SBD Dauntless, and 18 Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers, giving a total of 90 aircraft, but with room for spare airframes stowed in the crossbeams of the hangar. A shakedown cruise is a test voyage for a newly commissioned or refitted ship to evaluate its performance, systems, and crew readiness, identifying and correcting issues before operational deployment. American aircraft carriers usually conducted their shakedown cruises off Guantanamo Bay, but due to the threat posed by U-boats, a new area was chosen in Trinidad. The Gulf of Paria is a large, shallow, semi-enclosed inland sea located between the island of Trinidad and the east coast of Venezuela. For the duration of the war with Germany, all US carriers carried out their 2-week shakedown here. On completion, the ships returned to an East Coast shipyard for a post-shakedown overhaul before finally transferring to the Pacific. All units made the transfer from the Atlantic Fleet to the Pacific Fleet by way of the Panama Canal. The locks of the canal were 110 feet wide, and the waterline beam of a World War II Essex-Class carrier was 93 feet, making it a delicate operation. A 51-mile, 12-hour canal transit shaved weeks off the alternative route around Cape Horn. 5 units managed to make the passage in 1943. The first was Essex on May the 17th, and the last ship through was Intrepid on December the 9th. Intrepid had the misfortune of colliding with the wall of the canal. This meant that she would not join her 4 sister ships at Pearl Harbor in 1943, but was diverted to San Francisco for repairs. Once through and into the Pacific, the first 3 units headed straight to Pearl Harbor. In September, Bunker Hill stopped at San Diego to ferry extra aircraft and supplies to Pearl. This arrangement was often repeated for Essex-Class carriers visiting the West Coast during World War II. With 3 Essex-Class carriers and 2 Independence-class light carriers present at Pearl Harbor by August 1943, it was time to test their mettle against the Japanese. The Essex-Class made its combat debut of World War II in a hit-and-run raid against Marcus Island on August the 31st. Footage of the raid was famously captured for the film The Fighting Lady, as planes from the USS Essex and Yorktown hammered the remote outpost. Next, Lexington struck Tarawa on September the 18th. At the start of 1943, the only US fleet carriers in the Pacific was the old Saratoga and the battle-scarred Enterprise. In October, 6 new aircraft carriers operated together for the first time when Essex, Yorktown and Lexington, along with the CVLs Independence, Belleau Wood and Cabot, hit Wake Island. After this experience, it was decided to add large black flight deck numerals to help the pilots identify their own carrier. The 3 raids had been made by surprise, and the carriers had retired undetected by the Japanese. But how would they hold up under air attack? The answer came on November the 11th, when Essex and Bunker Hill, along with the CVL Independence, attacked the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul. The formation was detected, and some 80 Japanese planes were sent to attack. The new SK air search radar on Essex picked up the planes at 100 miles distance, and on Bunker Hill, the even newer SM radar crucially gave accurate height readings. This footage, taken aboard Essex, shows the full might of the ship's anti-aircraft guns putting up an awesome barrage. Many Japanese planes were shot down, and no damage was inflicted on the American ships. This engagement also saw the combat debut of the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, which would replace the aging Dauntless. Operation Galvanic, or the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, was a major US offensive in the Central Pacific in November 1943. The US Pacific Fleet was able to field a total of 19 aircraft carriers of various types. Among them were the 4 Essex-Class carriers operating out of Pearl Harbor. In the final month of the year, the first Essex-Class to sustain damage by enemy action occurred during a raid against the Japanese airbase on Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands. On the night of December the 4th, Lexington was struck by an aerial torpedo on the stern quarter. 9 crew lost their lives, but the carrier made it back to Pearl Harbor under her own power, where she was patched up in the new dry dock number 4. She was sent to Bremerton in Washington for permanent repairs at the end of the month and returned to action in March 1944. The camouflage scheme of Essex units operating in 1943 was all over navy blue. The commission of Hornet in November saw the introduction of a new dazzle scheme, as the main threat to the fleet was deemed to be from submarine attack. The broken lines and patterns were intended to confuse the observer regarding the ship's heading. Most of the units were repainted in this scheme in 1944, the details of which will follow in the next video. The end of 1943 saw Essex and Yorktown at Pearl Harbor. Bunker Hill was in the South Pacific. Lexington was undergoing repairs at Bremerton after being struck by a torpedo. Intrepid was also in dry dock in San Francisco for repairs to her bow after the Panama Canal collision. On the East Coast, Hornet and Wasp were on trials after being commissioned the previous month. An additional 11 units were under various stages of construction in the yards. I'll leave you with a selection of images from 1943. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to catch the next video where we move on to 1944.